Montana Territory, September 1878. The wind cut sharp across the plains when Abram Keaton spotted the broken wagon. He had been riding west since sunrise, dust caked across his clothes, hat pulled low, one hand resting heavy on the saddle horn. His horse, a dun mare named Willa, slowed without prompting. There, just off the trail, the wagon leaned to one side, one wheel snapped clean through. A woman stood beside it, skirts dust-covered, a hand pressed to her brow against the sun. Her hair was dark, tied back in a loose braid that had started to come undone. She looked up as Abram rode closer, and the moment their eyes met, something shifted in his chest like a rope pulled tight had finally gone slack. She smiled. It was not a wide smile. Just the corner of her mouth lifting as if she had seen something long missed, but it knocked the breath out of him. "Afternoon, ma'am," Abram said, dismounting. "Afternoon," she replied, voice steady. "You would not happen to have a wrench, would you?" He blinked. "A wrench," she nodded toward the broken wheel. "Split clean off. Axle's cracked too. I tried to lift it, but well, I'm not much of a blacksmith." Abram ran a hand across his jaw. "You out here alone?" "No," she motioned toward the wagon. "My son is inside, sleeping. He is 6. "Name's Graham." "Where's your husband?" Her smile did not falter, but her eyes cooled. "Buried near Fort Benton. Fever took him last winter." Abram pressed his lips together. "I am sorry, ma'am." "Zadie," she said. "Zadie Sutton," he nodded once. "Abram Keaton, a beat past." "Well, Mr. Keaton," Zadie said, brushing her hands off on her skirt, "if you are not in a hurry to anywhere, I could use some help." He was in a hurry to nowhere, but he walked to the back of her wagon anyway and crouched beside the damaged wheel. His hands, calloused from years of cattle drives and fence wire, moved slow and sure over the cracked wood. Her wagon was not going anywhere without serious repairs, and the nearest town was over 15 miles behind him. "This will take more than a wrench," he said. "I figured you got supplies." "A little. Dried beans, some bacon, not much water." She hesitated. "We were heading to my sister's in Helena. She said her husband needed help on their farm." Abram stood, brushing off his trousers. "You will not make it before nightfall, not on foot. And you cannot stay out here, I know. I can take you and the boy to Lewistown. It is a day's ride. You can rest there, get a new wagon, or wait for your sister to come get you." Zadie looked toward the wagon, then back at him. "Why help me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you smiled at me like I was something worth noticing." Her breath caught just a little, but she nodded. "All right." Graham was already awake when they approached the wagon. He peeked out from behind the canvas flap, his hair sticking up in every direction. Abram gave him a small nod. The boy did not speak, just stared at him with wide, watchful eyes. "Graham," Zadie said gently, "this is Mr. Keaton. He is going to help us get to town." The boy looked to his mother, then back to Abram. "Do you have a gun?" Abram blinked. "Yes. Have you ever shot a rattlesnake?" "Yes." The boy nodded once, satisfied. "Okay." They packed what they could onto Willa and Zadie's skinny mule. Zadie rode behind Abram. Graham settled in front of her, arms wrapped tight around his mother's waist. The trail was long, the sun hot, but the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. Abram found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, watching the way Zadie's chin rested lightly atop her son's head, her eyes steady on the horizon. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered in the distance. Abram urged the horses faster, and they reached an old line shack just as the first drops of rain hit the earth. It was abandoned but solid, with a dry roof and a rusted stove in the corner. Inside, Zadie spread a blanket on the floor for Graham, who fell asleep quick. Abram lit a lamp and stoked a small fire. Zadie sat near it, her hands stretched toward the warmth. "You always ride alone?" she asked. "Mostly." She looked at him. "Why?" He did not answer right away. "Then, lost my brother 3 years ago. We ran a ranch together near Miles City. After he passed, I could not stay." She nodded, quiet. "I lost my sister to cholera, then my husband." "You think you are done with grief, and then it hollows you out all over again." Abram sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "You are still standing." So are you. They did not speak for a while. The rain came harder. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. Inside, the fire cracked and warmed their boots. She looked up then, and he caught her gaze. There was something soft and sure in it, something that settled deep in him. "You smiled at me," he said again, low. "Yes. Why?" "Because you looked like a man who had not been smiled at in a long time." He leaned back against the wall, looked down at his hands. "You do not know what that did to me." Zadie tilted her head, studying him. "What did it do?" "It reminded me I am still alive." She reached across the space between them and touched his hand, just a light brush of her fingers, but it was enough. Enough to steady something inside him that had been broken for too long. They sat like that for a long time, the fire burning low, the storm churning outside. When sleep came for both of them, it came quiet and deep, with their shoulders nearly touching and something unspoken but strong settling between them. Neither of them said it, but both of them felt it. Something had begun. By morning, the rain had passed. The air outside the line shack was cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. Abram stepped out first, letting the door fall soft behind him. He crouched near the fire pit and stirred the damp ashes with a stick, watching steam rise from the blackened stones. Zadie followed a few minutes later, wrapping her shawl tighter around her. Her braid was pulled back neater now, and her boots left narrow tracks in the mud. She stood beside him in silence, eyes on the horizon where pale light touched the hills. "Graham's still asleep," she said, voice low. "He didn't stir once last night," he nodded. "He's tired, likely been that way a while." She shifted her weight, watching a pair of crows flap across the sky. "Helena feels farther every day." "It is," he said. "From here even more so." She didn't reply at first, just rubbed her arms and stared toward the east. Then, "You ever think about settling again?" Abram leaned back on his heels, the question hanging between them. "Sometimes." He looked at her. I think about what Graham needs." She glanced up. "I don't have the luxury of thinking much past that." He considered her a long moment. "You've been doing it all yourself." "Wasn't a choice." He stood then, brushing mud from his knees. "You ride ahead with me to Lewistown. I'll see you're taken care of, at least for a few days." Zadie tilted her head. "And then, we'll see." She looked down, a faint crease between her brows. "I've had promises before. They don't last long. I'm not offering a promise." He met her gaze. "I'm offering my word." Her eyes searched his, and something in her face softened, not with trust, not yet, but with the quiet knowledge that a man who'd stayed through a storm might stay a while longer. When Graham finally stirred, Zadie knelt and combed his hair with her fingers. Abram watched the boy rub sleep from his eyes, then sit up and blink slow toward the doorway where light filtered in. He didn't ask where they were, only stood and slipped his hand into his mother's as though it had never left. They rode out before the sun crested the ridge, the trail still slick from the night. Abram led the way, Willa sure-footed beneath him. The mule followed, slower but steady. Zadie kept hold of Graham with one arm, the other resting lightly at her side. By mid-morning they passed a stretch of burnt prairie, blackened stalks and singed fence posts, the remains of a fire long since gone cold. Abram slowed. "Lightning strike," he said. "Happened weeks ago, maybe more." Zadie's eyes moved across the charred ground. "It's strange, isn't it? How something can look dead and still come back." He nodded. "Seen wildflowers bloom through ash. Takes time, but it happens." They didn't speak for a while after that. The land shifted from open grass to low hills dappled with cottonwood groves. A hawk circled high overhead, silent against the wide blue. Around midday, Abram reined in near a creek that trickled narrow between the rocks. He filled 2 canteens, then handed one to Zadie. She drank, then passed it to Graham, who cupped it with both hands. "You always know where water is?" she asked. "Rode this trail enough to remember what matters." She wiped her mouth with her sleeve. "You from Montana?" "No, born near Council Bluffs, came west with my brother when we were boys. He wanted cattle, I followed." She didn't ask what happened next. He didn't offer. They reached the edge of Lewistown by late afternoon. A few weather-worn buildings lined the Main Street General Store, stables, a boarding house with a slanted porch and faded curtains. A woman swept the steps of the mercantile, glancing up as they rode in. Abram led them to a squat cabin near the edge of town, half hidden by aspens. It wasn't much, just a single room and a wood stove, but it stood straight and dry. "Belongs to an old friend," he said as he swung down. "He's been living near Bozeman the past year. Told me I could use it if I needed." Zadie helped Graham down and followed Abram inside. Dust clung to the window panes, but the floor was swept and the bed had a clean quilt folded at the foot. A low shelf held a tin lamp and a stack of firewood. "I'll get some supplies," Abram said. "You'll be safe here." She glanced around the space, then turned toward him. "You're leaving," he paused. "Just down the street. I'll be back before dark." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll be here." Graham tugged at her sleeve. "Is this where we live now?" Zadie crouched beside him. "Just for a little while." The boy looked at Abram. "Do you live here too?" Abram crouched, meeting the boy's eyes. "Not yet." Zadie's breath caught, but she said nothing. Abram stood and stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. Inside the cabin, Zadie sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Graham close. She rested her cheek against his hair and listened to the wind shift through the trees. The silence felt different now, less like waiting, more like something beginning. The next morning brought a brittle wind and low-hanging clouds that stretched close over the rooftops. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled softly. Zadie stood near it, sleeves rolled to her elbows, ladling a thin cornmeal mush into a tin bowl. Graham sat cross-legged on the floor, piecing together a rag doll from bits of fabric he'd found tucked in a drawer. Abram leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the boy's fingers move with quiet focus. "He's good with his hands," Abram said. Zadie glanced up without lifting her head. "He used to sit with his father while he carved. Learn to be careful not to rush." Abram stepped further into the room and crouched beside Graham. "What's her name?" The boy tilted his head, considering. "Haven't decided yet. I'm waiting to see what she acts like." Abram gave a single nod, then rose. "I'm heading to the stable." "Mule's got a limp, might be a stone in her hoof." Zadie wiped her hands on a cloth, laying it neatly on the small table. "I'll come with you. If she's hurt, I ought to see it myself." They walked side by side through the narrow lane behind the mercantile, the ground still damp beneath their boots. Lewistown stirred slow around them, an old man hauling sacks of oats across the yard. Two women hanging shirts on a line behind the boarding house. No one spoke as they passed, but heads lifted, eyes lingered. At the livery, Abram led the mule from the small corral and knelt beside her front leg. "She's favoring the left," he murmured. Zadie crouched beside him. "She's always been stubborn, but never limped." He ran his hand down the leg, careful, then pressed his thumb beneath the fetlock. The mule twitched but didn't pull away. "There it is," he said, drawing a small, jagged stone from just beneath the hoof wall. "She'll walk better by evening." Zadie exhaled and leaned back on her heels. "I thought it might be worse." Abram stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "You've got a light hand with her. She listens to you. I had to learn, not many folks around to do it for me." There was no pity in his gaze, only quiet regard. "You thinking of staying?" She didn't answer right away. "I don't know yet. Helena's still far, and I don't know if my sister's husband would make room for a boy not his own." Abram looked toward the cabin. "There's land just north of here. Belongs to an old rancher who passed last spring. No kin to inherit. Folks say the county's looking to sell it off cheap before winter." Zadie turned her face toward him. "You think I ought to buy land? I think you know how to survive, and I think Graham deserves a place to put down roots." She studied him, her eyes narrowing only slightly. "You sound like a man who's already decided something." "I haven't." His voice was even, "but I've thought about what it'd look like." They walked back slow, the mule trailing behind. When they reached the cabin, Graham was still on the floor, doll now dressed in a scrap of red calico tied with twine. He looked up when the door opened, and Zadie smiled. "Any trouble?" she asked. He shook his head. She hasn't said anything yet. That night Abram cooked. The stew wasn't much salt pork, onion, a few withered carrots, but the smell filled the room and made Zadie lean back in her chair with her eyes closed. Graham fell asleep halfway through a story he was telling, and Abram lifted him carefully to the bed, boots dangling loose from his feet. Zadie stood at the window, arms folded. The lamp cast her shadow long across the floorboards. He doesn't ask about his father much anymore, but I can tell when he's thinking on him. Abram joined her, standing just behind. You don't have to tell me anything. I know. She turned slightly. But I want to. He waited. He was a quiet man, slow to laugh, but he worked hard, never raised his voice, not once. Even when he was sick, he tried to make it easier on us. She looked out again, voice lower now. When he died, I buried him with his boots beside him. He never liked to be without them. Abram's hand brushed lightly against her back, not a comfort, not a claim, just steady presence. You still wear yours like you're waiting to ride off, she said. I was, until now. She let that settle between them. Then, you said you lost your brother. What was his name? Elias. What did he love most? Abram's jaw shifted. Horses and music, played the fiddle at every barn dance from here to Billings. She turned toward him fully. Do you still hear it? Sometimes. His eyes didn't leave hers. Especially when it's quiet. Zadie reached forward, laid her hand gently over his chest. It's quiet now. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just let her fingers rest there, as if anchoring something inside him that had long been drifting. Outside, a coyote called once, far off. Then silence again. He covered her hand with his, and neither of them looked away. On the fifth morning, frost silvered the grass behind the cabin, and the first breath outside turned white in the air. Zadie stepped onto the porch with a shawl tight around her shoulders, her boots sending a faint creak into the stillness. Graham was inside, tracing letters into the soft wood of the table with the tip of a burnt matchstick, the way he'd watched a schoolteacher do once in Fort Benton. Abram came up from the stable, sleeves rolled, a single leather strap coiled in his hand. Mule's walking even again, he said. She favors the left a little, but she'll carry what needs carrying. Zadie rubbed one hand over her arm. I've been thinking on the land you mentioned. He waited. I want to see it, she said. Before the ground freezes, if it's as you say, maybe I'll put down something for good. Abram nodded. It's 3 ridges north, not far, but we'd have to ride out within the hour if we want to make it back before sundown. I'll ask Mrs. Tilly to watch Graham, she said. She's taken a liking to him, called him stubborn as a goat, but twice as clever. You trust her. She raised 7 boys and buried 2. She knows how to keep a child fed and safe. By the time they saddled Willa and packed a light parcel of bread and dried apple slices, the frost had melted from the grass. Mrs. Tilly waved them off from her porch without rising from her chair, her apron dusted with flour and a pipe clamped between her teeth. The trail north cut along a slow rise where the hills leaned into each other, wind pressing the dry grass in steady waves. Zadie rode behind for a time, her eyes tracing the horizon, then drew up beside Abram. She didn't look at him when she spoke. I used to think Montana was too wide, she said. Like I'd walk forever and never find where I belonged. And now, her fingers tightened on the reins. Now I wonder if maybe I just hadn't looked long enough. They rode in silence for a stretch, the only sound the quiet creak of saddle leather and the soft snort of the mule behind them. When they crested the 3rd ridge, Abram pulled Willa to a halt and gestured with his chin. Below, the land dipped into a shallow basin ringed with cottonwoods, a narrow stream cutting through the middle. A scatter of old fence posts leaned half-fallen near the far edge, and the remains of a stone chimney stood alone at the center, the hearth still intact. There used to be a cabin, Abram said. Lightning took it, but the stone held. Zadie dismounted without a word and walked down the slope, boots sinking into the soft earth. She knelt near the stream, letting her palms skim the surface. Then she turned and scanned the field, eyes resting on the broken fence, the chimney, the cottonwoods. You think it's enough? she asked, standing again. More than most start with. She wandered to the stone hearth. Her hand trailed across the rough surface, fingertips tracing the soot lines. I could build new walls, she said. Plant squash and beans come spring, paint the door blue. Abram stepped closer but didn't touch her. You do all that alone, she looked up then. I don't believe I'd be alone. The wind moved between them, soft and cold. Abram's voice dropped low. I've been riding too long with no place to come home to. I didn't know how much I needed one. Zadie's eyes didn't waver. I only meant to get Graham to my sister. I never planned on starting over. You still can, he said. But you don't have to do it without someone beside you, she exhaled, slow. I don't want to be someone's burden. You're not, he said. You're the reason I remembered what it felt like to want something again. She stepped forward, just close enough that her hand could rest lightly against his chest. His breath hitched, but he didn't move. Her voice was quiet. If I build a home here, I want it to be with someone who'll wake before dawn and tend the mule, who'll teach my son how to read the sky and mend a fence, someone who doesn't run when the nights go long and hard. Abram's hand came to rest over hers. I'll be here, every morning. Every night. She leaned in then, her forehead resting against his shoulder as though letting some long-held weight fall away. He wrapped his arms around her gently, like he knew what it meant to hold something without breaking it. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When the sun began to dip behind the ridge, they mounted up again and rode back slow, the light golden and long across the basin. The chimney stood behind them, still tall, still waiting. At the cabin, Graham was asleep against Mrs. Tilley's knee, his fingers curled around the red calico doll. Zadie gathered him into her arms with a soft hum in her throat, and Abram held the door open as they stepped inside. That night, he sat at the table whittling a sliver of pine into the first shape of a toy horse. Zadie stitched a new hem into Graham's coat. The fire burned steady. They didn't speak of what came next. They didn't need to. It was already theirs. The following week settled them into a rhythm neither had expected to find so soon. Abram repaired the cabin's drafty window frames with scraps salvaged from the old livery store, and Zadie stitched new curtains from a bolt of muslin traded for a jar of preserves. Graham spent his mornings with Mrs. Tilley, who had decided without asking that he'd start letters and sums before the month was out. Zadie didn't argue. She only packed him a small satchel each day and kissed his forehead as she handed it over. One chilled afternoon, Abram led Zadie to the county office, where the clerk, a balding man with spectacles and a slow drawl, spread out a deed map across the desk. She signed her name with a hand that didn't shake, and Abram added his below with quiet steadiness. The land north of Lewistown became theirs, and no one raised a brow at the fact they weren't yet wed. Folks had seen stranger arrangements, and neither Zadie nor Abram had ever relied on the approval of strangers. As the first snow came light against the hills, they began carting stones from the creek to rebuild the chimney. Abram laid each piece with care, his shirt sleeves rolled, fingers raw but sure. Zadie worked beside him, her coat tied close, setting mortar with a mason's patience. They spoke little while they worked, but laughter sometimes rose when one of them misjudged the weight of a stone, or when the wind stole Zadie's bonnet and sent it tumbling into the brush. One evening, when the hearth stood high and square, Zadie stepped back and wiped her hands on a rag. Abram was still crouched, setting the keystone. I never asked, she said, what made you stop riding? He looked up, the last of the light catching the edge of his jaw. You did. She watched him stand, slow and tall. I didn't mean to. You didn't have to. Later that night, back in the cabin, she found a small wooden box wrapped in burlap on the table. Inside was a fiddle, worn but polished, the strings newly tightened. I found it in a trader's cart, Abram said, his hand resting lightly on the chair back. It's not Elias's, but I thought maybe I could still learn. Zadie touched the neck of the instrument. You ever play before? Only watched, but I remember the sound. She lifted it gently and handed it back. Then make it yours. He didn't play that night. He only rested it on the shelf by the door, as if giving it time to settle into the room. By the time the first deep snow covered the basin, the new cabin stood one room with a loft for Graham and a wide hearth that burned clean. Zadie painted the door pale green, not blue, after Graham declared that green felt more like home. They hung dried apples from the rafters and smoked venison in the back shed. Abram carved a cradle for the red calico doll, which Graham now called Miss Sunday on account of her always being dressed for company. On a still morning just after the year turned, Zadie stepped outside with a kettle in her hand and found Abram brushing snow from the mule's flanks. He looked up when he heard her approach. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited, brushing slow. "I don't want to wait for spring." He set the brush down. "For what?" "For you to ask." She looked at him clear-eyed. "I'll say yes." He crossed the space between them, boots crunching over the crusted snow, and took the kettle from her hand. "Then I'm asking." She nodded once. "Good." They were married by Reverend Haskett in the church on the far side of town with Mrs. Tilly standing as witness and Graham holding the fiddle Abram had begun to learn, though he only played the one tune he knew slow, halting, but enough to make Zadie smile through the whole of it. They spent their wedding night not speaking much, only letting their hands learn the shape of a life finally chosen. The fire burned down low, but neither of them noticed the cold. They had built warmth between them long before. By the time spring reached the basin, their fields were turned and planted. Graham had a calf of his own, a brown-eyed heifer he named Clover. Abram played in the evenings better now, his fingers remembering faster than he expected, and Zadie sang sometimes, soft and clear, usually when she thought no one was listening. But Abram always was. One warm dusk, as they sat on the porch with Graham tucked between them and the dogwood blooming at the edge of the fence, Zadie leaned her head against Abram's shoulder. "You happy?" she asked. He turned, kissed her temple. "I wasn't before you." She reached for his hand. "I wasn't either." They sat long after the sun slipped behind the hills, the quiet full and steady. Their shadows stretched long behind them, joined in the fading light, and they stayed always just like that together, rooted deep with love that had been earned, not stumbled into. A love that held,